Welcome. My name is Dr. Anton Beckerman. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Economics at MSU. Today we are talking about the mechanics and uses of basis. So marketing concepts, price concepts. We're going to be thinking about what basis is and applying it to predicting prices, which is of course always a hot button issue whenever you're talking with producers, whenever I talk with producers. Okay, so let's start with just motivating this talk with a very simple concept. Why is this important to you? Two-word answer: financial success, right? So financial success and solvency is always really, really important to agricultural producers, to any producers really. But one of the barriers or challenges to being financially successful is the fact that often the financial outcomes, right, your profit or your revenues, are not known until the production process is finished, right? So think about it. You put seed in the ground, you put on fertilizer, and you wait for it, and you don't know what your yields are going to be. You don't know in the spring what the prices are going to be in the fall when you decide to market. And so you need to make some sort of decision about how much you're going to produce, what you're willing to invest, and then going forward, what you can expect your profit and your bottom line to be. So those are, of course, really important pieces of information to know, but they're kind of difficult to find out, especially with markets that are as dynamic as agricultural markets. So what might help? Well, in a perfect world, of course, perfect knowledge would help, right? So if you can just get a fortune cookie, pull out a tab that says, look, next year you're going to produce 47 bushels per acre, and you're going to sell it at a price of $5.28 a bushel. If you knew that information, you would be able to perfectly forecast what your costs need to be in order to earn a profit, right? Unfortunately, fortune cookies often come with messages that are either very difficult to understand or are just nonsensical. It is what it is. So if we can't find a fortune cookie that can tell us exactly the information that we need to know, what do we need to do? Okay, so today's goals are going to be about finding somewhere between not having any knowledge at all about what those prices and future outcomes going to be, and somewhere between that and a fortune cookie that can exactly tell you the information. All right, so what are we going to do? We're going to talk about basis. You may have heard this term before, maybe you even know something about it, but we're going to dive deeper into what basis is, the concept of basis, right? So what is it? Why does it happen? We're also going to talk about some of the applications of basis, and in my world and in my research, one of the more useful applications of basis is predicting prices. And we'll talk about why basis is perhaps a better predictor of prices than any other instrument that's out there. And then the last thing that we'll talk about is what are the economic factors that impact basis, right? So what can we look for in market dynamics, and what can we learn from, say, market news coming out that could help us better understand how our prediction of prices for the future, how that might be affected. Okay, so 3 goals today, and we're going to go through each one of them in turn. Okay, so let's start with this. Let's imagine that you came from another planet and you know nothing about agricultural markets, or maybe you came from another industry. You know nothing about agricultural markets, and you are asked to predict winter wheat price on August 21st of next year. Okay, so maybe you have some knowledge of the business world, or maybe you're just, a decently smart person. You know nothing about agricultural markets. You know nothing about what basis is, or anything about how price occurs or moves in agricultural markets, but you're asked to solve this problem. What do you do? Okay. Well, here's a few reasonable possibilities. I was trying, as I was putting this talk together, kind of go back and think about what I would have answered before, 10, 12 years ago when I really started to get into research in agricultural economics. So one thing that you can do is very simple. Look at what the August 21st price was today and say that, okay, that seems like a pretty reasonable price for August 21st of next year. Seems pretty easy, seems pretty straightforward. Of course, that would assume that nothing happens between this year's August 21st and next year's August 21st to affect that price. You guys know about agricultural markets. To say that nothing will happen in a year is nonsense, right? So things are going to change. Okay, the second possible approach would be maybe to compute the average price around August 21st for the past 3 to 5 years, right? So you're bringing in a little bit more information than the first bullet point where you just used last year's price to predict next year's price. Let's take an average, right? Let's take it the past few years and say that that average price is going to be a pretty good estimate of what next year's price is going to be. Okay? Seems reasonable. And maybe a third possibility is, instead of looking at just August 21st, let's look at the third week of August, right? That captures August 21st and maybe August 18th through the 25th. Whatever, right? So you're trying to bring in more information and use that additional information to try to make a better prediction. So here's the issue, right? We can absolutely look at each one of those 3 bullet points. Let me go back to them just for your reference. We can look at each one of these 3 bullet points and dissect them and find strengths and weaknesses of each one of these proposed possible answers to the question of what is next August's price going to be for winter wheat. But there's one important weakness in all of these proposals. And any proposal that uses price and previous prices and information about price to predict future prices. And that is that all of these methods are using price as the prediction instrument. Okay, that's dangerous. That's on the surface, it sounds like a pretty good idea, right? You're using information about past prices to predict future prices, but that's dangerous. Let's talk about why. What gives, right? I told you to predict price next year, and now all of a sudden I'm saying that it's dangerous. Why is that? Well, take a look at. I have a bunch of data sitting on my computer. I just pulled one location, Great Falls for Montana, on August 21st, a few days before and a few days after. Some years, August 21st is a weekend, and so maybe I use August 20th or August 22nd or something like that. But it's all around that date for winter wheat of 12% protein between 1989 and 2016. Look at what's happening to price. Right? So in 1989, we started right around $4 a bushel, and then we went down to $2.75 a bushel. Then we kind of were a little, more stable for the next few years at $3 a bushel. And then we shot up to $4.75, and then the next year we shot down to almost $2. And in the late 2000s and early 2010s, look at the huge swings between, going from $4 a bushel to $8.75, back down to $4.50, back up to nearly $8. Look at that volatility, right? That is the danger of using previous year's prices to predict next year's prices, is this inherent volatility and uncertainty in prices. Okay, take a look at this. So again, I used the same data that you just saw, and what I did was I calculated what was the average change in price from one year to the next. Okay, so each year I said, okay, what was the change between last year's price and this year's price? And then over the 20-year history, I calculated an average. So on average, for Great Falls August 21st price for winter wheat of a certain protein level, we could say that, knowing nothing else, the best prediction that we can make is that price is going to be on average, $1.35 per bushel different than last year's price. Okay, so we could have up to $1.30. Price can be either higher by $1.35 or lower by $1.35 than it was last year. That's on average, right? Some years it was much more than $1.35. So some years price went up by more than $1.35. Some years price went down by more than $1.35. But on average, that's $1.35 per bushel of risk that you're exposed to if you're using prices to predict future years' prices. Okay, that's a lot. Think about it. If you have a 2,000 acre farm and you're producing on average 40 bushels an acre, right? That's 80,000 bushels that you're producing, and a difference of $1.35 per bushel on those 80,000 bushels, that's a lot of money. That is a lot of money that you could lose out on or win. Absolutely, you could win if prices move up, but you could lose an entire $1.35 per bushel if you predicted that price to be wrong, right? And on average, what we've seen is if you use last year's price to predict next year's price, you can be off by $1.35 very, very easily. Okay, that's the main problem. That's the danger that you could fall into if you use prices as your prediction tool. Okay, so what we need to do is figure out whether there's a better measure that's less volatile, right? We don't want that $1.35 difference from one year to the next that we could be wrong on. What we want is something that's a much smaller change from year to year, so that even if we make a mistake, that mistake costs us much less than $1.35 per bushel. Okay, and that measure, that's basis. Okay, that's what we're going to be relying on. That's going to be our main instrument of interest. Okay, some basics, very basics. This is the only math equation that I'm going to give you. This is, I'm an economist. It's in the contract that every talk that I give has to have at least one equation, one math equation. So this is it. This is it. This is all you're going to get. Okay, so what is basis? Basis is a value. It's measured in dollars. Often it's cents, but sometimes it's dollars. And it represents a value for a specific location. So whether it's Great Falls or Moccasin or Macon or Sydney or somewhere else. So for a specific location, each location has its own basis. For a specific point in time, so we have to either say, August 21st or the third week of August or the month of August. So now we have two parameters. So it's going to be Great Falls on August 21st or Macon on September 2nd or something else. So specific location, specific point in time for a specific commodity, right? So for winter wheat or for spring wheat or for corn or for feeder cattle, right? We can have different basis values in the same location at the same point in time, but for different commodities, right? So for example, if there's an elevator in Shelby, Montana, and it receives both peas and winter wheat, then you can have a basis value for peas in Shelby, Montana on August 21st, and you can have a basis value for winter wheat in Shelby, Montana on August 21st. Okay, so basis has a very specific location, point in time, and it refers to a specific commodity. Okay, so that's point number one. The second definition is this math formula. So basis is, by definition, a combination of two components. It's a component of the local cash price at the specific location and a specific point in time for a specific commodity, minus the futures price at that specific point in time for that commodity, right? So if you're looking at winter wheat, you're going to say, okay, it's going to be the local price in Great Falls for winter wheat on August 21st minus the futures price for a winter wheat contract on August 21st. Okay, so you take those two prices, you subtract them from one another, you subtract the futures price from the cash price, and the remaining, the difference is basis. Okay, basis could be either positive or negative. Often in Montana, it's going to be negative for wheat or any other crop, and it's often going to be positive for cattle. Sometimes it can be negative. We'll talk about some of those characteristics of what changes basis later in the talk. Okay, but for crops, it's almost always going to be negative. For livestock, it often is positive and sometimes is negative. Okay, here's the intuitive benefits of using basis, or of just understanding what basis is and tracking basis over time and seeing how basis changes, whether it strengthens or gets higher or less negative, more positive, or it weakens or gets more negative or less not positive, more negative. Okay, so the intuitive benefits of basis is that it combines economic information about local market conditions and national and global market conditions. And that's a typo. It should be local market conditions should be cash prices, and the national and global market conditions should be futures prices. Okay, and that's described in the bullet points below. Right, and that's really beneficial. That's much more powerful than just relying on, observing what happens to local cash prices, or just relying on futures prices, okay, without having any knowledge about cash prices. Okay, so what's the benefit here? Well, local cash prices often reflect market conditions that are specific to the location where the sales or the procurement of a commodity actually occurs. Right, so let's say that you have a drought like we did this year in northeast Montana, right, and up the High Line. Well, local cash prices are going to much more accurately reflect the fact that wheat production was very bad or poor in that particular area of the country, right? So those local cash prices might be higher because the supply of wheat was lower this year than expected. Okay, so local cash prices are really useful to say something about those local market conditions where U.S. producers will be delivering, or where you as cattle producers will be delivering or selling your cattle in auctions, for example. So Billings is a pretty big auction site for feeder cattle. So is Miles City. So those are two locations where local cash prices are collected quite frequently. Futures prices, so before I go to future prices, so local prices alone, cash prices alone are helpful, but they only say something about that local condition, right? They don't necessarily reflect what's happening in the rest of the world. And we know that, especially in wheat markets, where it's such a global market, the U.S. produces only 8 to 9% of global wheat, right? So, and Montana is a much, a smaller proportion of that, even because, we don't produce all 9% of U.S. wheat, or all 100% of U.S. wheat. So, what happens in the rest of the world, Russia or Ukraine or Kazakhstan or China or Brazil, that's going to impact wheat prices. But what happens in Brazil isn't going to be necessarily reflected in the local cash prices that you see in Sydney, Montana. But that information about Brazil or Kazakhstan or Ukraine or France, what happens in those markets, that's going to be reflected in those futures prices because they reflect the national and global conditions. Okay, so if Brazil has some issues with exporting beef or producing beef, that's going to be reflected in the futures prices for cattle, right? If India, for example, has a really good wheat year, that's going to be reflected in the futures prices for wheat. All right. So the basis, the advantage of basis, the big advantage of basis is that it combines that national and global information about markets for that commodity with local information about your specific market where you might be delivering to. Okay, that's the big advantage, the intuitive economic advantage of using bases rather than using prices alone, whether you're using futures prices or local cash prices. Okay, when you use bases, it combines those two pieces of information together. The second advantage of bases is that because it combines those two prices together, it becomes much less volatile from one year to the next than prices. We'll talk about the mechanics of why that is in a second, but that's the other big advantage, is that remember when you had that $1.35 average year-to-year change between prices? Well, bases is much less volatile than that. Let me show you. Okay, so here it is. Here is the same Great Falls August 21st winter wheat 12% protein time series or data series, but it's now basis. So this is, it took that local price in Great Falls that I showed you before and then subtracted from it the futures price for winter wheat on those dates. Okay, so you can see that you have ups and downs, and basis does go up and down, and you even have quite a bit of a down year in 2010, and maybe you're saying to yourself, wait a second, this looks just as volatile as prices did. Good point. I agree with you, and here is my retort. When I put the prices and the bases on the same graph, look at the difference. Okay, when prices, that brown or reddish bar, when it's going up and down, up by $2, down by $1.50, up by 75 cents, down by $3, up by $4, right? Look at what's happening to bases. Yeah, it's going up and down, but not nearly as much as prices, right? It might go up by 20 cents, 40 cents, 15 cents. Sometimes it goes in very peculiar years like we had in 2010. It went down by 75 cents or $1. But not nearly as volatile and uncertain as prices are. Okay, and what that translates to is when you use bases instead of prices, you are exposing yourself to much less risk when you're using bases as your prediction tool for predicting futures prices than if you use past price information. Okay. Take a look at this difference, right? So average year-to-year price change between 1989 and 2016, $1.35. And if you look at the basis, the average year-to-year basis change is 32 cents per bushel. Okay, so think about it. What are you more likely to benefit from? Right? If you're a producer who only wants to make sure that they at least break even, and so you need to predict a price and then structure your yearly production practices such that you at least break even, and you're making a prediction, and one instrument using past prices gives you a potential to be wrong by as much as $1.35 or sometimes more, while the other instrument, basis, only gives you the chance that you'll be wrong by 30 cents. Okay, I think I would take the 30 cents instead of the $1.30 personally. Okay, so basis is much less volatile and so exposes you to much lower risk than if you were using prices. Okay, this is the point of the conversation. Anytime I do classes or anytime that I prep a talk, to producer groups or to agribusinesses, halfway between the presentation, I always stop and ask the question, okay, this is all very interesting, but who cares, right? Why should you believe me, and how is this useful to you? Okay, really good question. This helps me kind of reset and go back to the main issue of this presentation, which is how can this information be useful to you? Okay, So we know that basis is much less volatile. It's much more economically useful because it combines information about markets, both global markets and local markets. So how can you use this to benefit your operation? So as I mentioned, basis can be particularly useful for making local cash price predictions, right? So instead of going in and saying, look, I don't know anything about agricultural markets, so my best bet about what prices are going to be next year is just to look at what prices were in the past. Instead, you're going to do a little bit of math work, but it's fairly straightforward, and it gives a much more accurate prediction than just using price data. Okay, so let's recall our task from a while ago. We want to predict winter wheat prices on August 21st of next year. And as an example, just to stick with our Great Falls location, winter wheat, 12% protein, let's say that we're predicting it for August 21st of 2018. Okay, so there's a couple strategies that we can use, right? So strategy one was, let's just use our 3-year average of past prices. Okay, so let's say you really don't believe me and you say, basis schmaces. Prove it to me, Beckerman. Tell me why the basis is a better bet of predicting prices than using average past prices. Okay, so let's look at the average August 21st price for 2015, 2016, 2017. And let's average those up, and what we get is a predicted local price of $3.96 per bushel. Okay? But here's the issue. Your margin of error is, it could be as high as about $5.40 per bushel. So you could be wrong in the underestimating the price, but here's the bad side. It could be wrong by $1.35 down as well. So it could turn out to be as low as, what is that, $2.60, about $2.60 a bushel. Okay, so that's a pretty big difference between about $4 a bushel and $2.60. Right, so that's the margin of error that you're getting if you're using that 3-year average of past prices. Okay, now here's how things would change if we used basis. Okay, so the predicted local price in Great Falls on August 21st is the futures price, okay, plus the historical basis that we've observed in Great Falls on August 21st. And we'll talk about historical basis in much more detail in a second. Okay, so for futures price, just for reference, what we want to do is use the closest futures contract to your prediction date. Okay, so for example, if we're trying to predict August 21st prices, the closest futures contract to August 21st is the September winter wheat futures contract. So we would use that futures price to plug into our formula here. Okay, so a couple of days ago I went out, I pulled out the futures price. It was about $4.71 a bushel, and then the historical basis for Great Falls winter wheat, 12% protein, is negative 60 cents a bushel. And so our prediction for Great Falls is $4.11 per bushel, and that's pretty close to the $3.96 that we got with the price. Here's the big difference. The margin of error in your prediction is much smaller, right? So where if you use prices, you could expect a margin of error to be between $5.50 and $2.60. Here, the margin of error is only 32 cents. So you could be, you're looking at a range of prices between $3.80 and about $4.40. It is a lot easier and a lot more effective and efficient to make your decisions on your operation when you have a fairly small range of prices for which you can plan for, right? So when you know that you are likely to sell your 12% winter wheat next year for a price that's between 380 and 440, it's a lot easier to make decisions, input decisions and production decisions, having knowledge of that interval than having knowledge that your price could be anywhere between 550 and 260, right? When it's between 550 and 260, gosh, that is a lot of things that you can change and you can adjust, that could go wrong, right? When you have a much smaller interval and a much smaller margin of error, you can plan a lot better. Okay, so here's just a summary, right? Here's the prediction summary. Here's what you can expect and what going into it, what you would plan for your operation. Your predicted price range in strategy 1 using just prices was between 260 and 530, and strategy 2 using bases, the predicted price range is between 380 and 443. Okay, so a much tighter prediction, which gives you a much better indication of what prices will be and allows you to plan more effectively and more cost effectively. Okay, a couple other additional questions that came out from our little exercise there. Okay, one is, why? Why is basis a more stable predictor of prices? I've showed you that it is, but I haven't really talked about why, right? I said that, yeah, it'll be a less volatile predictor, but why? Second, I put up this in the formula for predicting prices. I said, well, it's the sum of the futures price and this historical basis, quote unquote. Well, how do we calculate this historical basis? What is it? What is it going to be? What is the number that you should use? Okay, and then the last question is, why does current basis differ from historical basis, right? Maybe you've calculated this historical basis and you see that, well, sometimes the basis that you actually observe is maybe 5 cents above that historical basis, and maybe it's sometimes 10 cents below. Why does this matter? And more importantly, how is that information useful to you? Okay, so let's start with, why is basis a more stable predictor of prices? Well, number one, it's a forward-looking structure. Okay, unlike using just past information about prices, so right in strategy 1, it was saying, well, let's look at the last 3 years of prices, let's take that average, and that's a very backward-looking process, right? You're only looking in history. With basis, you're using futures prices, which is basically it's a way that the market is trying to predict what commodity prices are going to be in the future, right? So you're combining information about forward-looking price prediction in the futures market, and then you're attaching to that historical information about your local market conditions. Right? So it's a very forward-looking structure for making predictions, which I think intuitively makes sense that that's going to be a more accurate way of making price predictions if you're looking forward instead of just looking backwards. Okay. Second is, elevators and large processors look to and use futures markets when making pricing decisions. So even though you as a producer may never use futures markets to hedge your price risk, you may never use options to hedge your price risk, you better believe that the elevators or the feedlots or the meat processors, they're using futures markets on a daily basis. Every time that they make a forward contract with you for you to deliver wheat or for you to deliver cattle, they're hedging their price risk by using futures markets. Okay, and so changes that happen to prices in the futures markets, they're going to be reflected in local markets because those elevators and large processors, they look to futures markets. And so what happens in the futures market prices is going to be relatively similar to what is going to be happening in local markets. Not 100%. They're not in sync 100%. but they're going to move in very similar patterns, and I'll show you an example of that in a second. And that movement in a very similar pattern is what makes bases much more stable. Okay? And again, because cash prices move in sync with futures prices, the basis, which is the difference between local cash prices and futures prices, is going to be much less volatile. Okay, this is much easier to visualize. So here's what I did. I put on here both the September futures price for winter wheat, okay, that's in the blue line, and then the local Great Falls price per bushel for winter wheat 12% protein. Okay, that's the brown or reddish line. Look at how close those guys trend each other. Okay, as I said, not perfect. Sometimes that difference, right? So the white between the two curves is the basis. It's that difference between local and futures price. Sometimes that white space gets larger. Sometimes it's almost indistinguishable. But that white space is very, very consistent with overall price trends. Okay, so because those price trends are going up and down in a very similar pattern, the difference between those two price trends or price series, which is the basis, right, that's going to be very close to zero and going to be right around that, between about $1 and zero, $0 and negative, sorry, $0 and negative $1. Okay, so that's the underlying reason for why basis is so stable, is that futures and local prices move together because elevators and processors look to futures markets and then translate that information into local prices at which they contract with producers. So you knowing something, you as a producer knowing something about how elevators and processors make their pricing decisions is ultimately going to help you better understand when and how to market your product, as well as better understand how to make price predictions in the future. Okay, so those are the two key takeaways from this talk today. This is, even if you don't use basis for any other reason, knowing that elevators and processors look to futures markets and local prices are going to trend with futures markets, that should help you make marketing decisions better. Okay, so how should historical basis be calculated? There's typically, in the research, there's two approaches. Okay, there's sort of the easy, straightforward approach, which is often used by, just if you don't have anything else, this is better than nothing, and actually it's pretty good. Okay, sometimes much more complex economic models don't outperform the very simple approach, which is that first bullet, which is what you do is you calculate basis. So you take the local price minus the futures price in the past 3 years for a certain date. So you look at, say, August 21st, 2016, August 21st, 2015, August 21st, 2014, calculate basis for those 3 years, and then average them out. Okay, and that's going to serve as your historical basis for this upcoming year. Okay, and usually it's between 3 and 4 years, depending on the commodity, depending on where you are. I've always recommended using 3 years for Montana wheat. That seems to work fairly well, and I've looked into using 4 years or even longer, and it doesn't add much. So 3 years is a pretty good number. You don't want to go too much less than that, because it's not then it's not going to have enough information about local historical market conditions. But you don't want to go too far, so you don't want to use like 10 years of basis information, because then you're incorporating data that's now out of date. Right? So you don't want to use data that's stale. So 3 to 4 years seems to be a pretty good middle ground. That's a good, straightforward approach that if you're in a bind, you can look up futures prices. You can, take a look at what you sold your cattle or your wheat at in the past couple years and calculate bases and use that as your historical basis to predict prices going forward. A second approach, and this is actually what a lot of my research focuses on, is using statistical economic models that estimate bases. And these models take into account lots and lots of market forces that could influence bases. Okay, and so just to give you an example, my line of research focuses on wheat, so I know more about wheat bases than I do about cattle bases, but I'll show you in a second some of the research that I was able to pull up for cattle. So for example, statistical models of wheat bases have included factors like seasonality. So when are you calculating bases? Are you calculating bases right at harvest time versus sometime later in the marketing year? Let's look at previous values of bases. So yeah, we want to use that historical information in addition to other information, right? So we want to use the previous year. We might want to use bases that occurred in the past couple weeks, right? Because yeah, it's important to know what happened this time last year, but it also might be important to know how markets are behaving recently, right? We might want to look at volatility. Are bases really volatile or are they fairly stable? We want to look at futures prices and futures price uncertainty, right? Are global and national markets, are they all over the place, or do we have really good information about what's going on and that kind of smooths and calms markets down, right? So volatility is really important. There's a really interesting paper that has showed that as futures price volatility increases, that increases the risk of elevators, grain elevators, making contracts with producers. And elevators don't like risk. So what they do is when futures price volatility increases, and so doing it increases elevators' risk, they pass on some of that risk to producers in the form of lower prices, right? So what elevators do is they share that risk with producers. Okay, so if, for example, you're looking at prices and all of a sudden you read an article that says, oh man, futures prices are really volatile in the past couple of weeks, you might have a better understanding of why you're seeing lower prices at elevators, right? And same thing with basis volatility. If basis has become more volatile recently, you might be seeing lower prices and might want to wait out or take advantage of that volatility. Some of my more recent research has looked at density of elevators. So if you have more competition versus less competition, that impacts bases. Grain elevators technology and capacity. Larger shuttle loaders are going to offer higher prices, so they're going to have stronger or more positive, less negative bases. More conventional, smaller elevators, they don't have those cost savings, so they can't pass on those cost savings to farmers as much. Cost of transportation, that's a big one. So you're going to hear, you may have heard that, all basis is just transportation cost between one location and another. Well, that's true. There's also a bunch of other factors that are involved, but yeah, cost of transportation is a really big reason for the difference in transporting wheat or any other crop, and will affect basis values. I'll talk about a really interesting specific example in a little bit. Access to rail line. So is the elevator, do they have an access to a rail line, or is it just a trucking elevator? That'll impact basis. The spread between winter and spring prices, the protein content of wheat, and other factors that if you're interested in, we can chat later after the presentation. You can get in contact with me and we can chat about some of the other research that has been out there. But these are the main factors that are out there that are repeatedly found to be important to basis. So these are also the factors that you should look for, or you should at least keep in the back of your mind, that if something changes to those factors, you will need to also consider how that's going to impact your ability to predict prices, and also how that's going to impact local prices that you observe. For cattle bases, very similar things, right? So past basis values, basis volatility, futures price volatility, seasonality, time of the year that cattle are being sold and bought. Corn and soybean prices are also important because that's inputs into fed cattle production, right? So if corn and soybean prices go up or down, that's going to impact futures prices, and that's going to impact your bases and ultimately local price predictions in your local location. And also cattle characteristics, the sex, the weight, the frame, the class, all of that is going to impact how, the differences between bases for cattle. There's a really interesting concept. I haven't seen too much research on this, but I've plotted these data, and boy, it looks really suggestive that the cattle that are the feeder cattle that are being produced in the northern Great Plains states, because they're brought up in harsher weather conditions and they're being brought up in larger herd sizes, with ranchers focusing on cattle production rather than having more mixed operations, those cattle are actually worth more and are perceived to be higher quality and likely are higher quality. And so that has actually made bases positive. So the local price in Montana is actually higher than the futures price, which often reflects the Midwest cattle operations. Okay, so that's a really interesting thing that is worth keeping in mind, that quality also is a big factor in predicting bases. Okay, so you're saying to yourself, great, lots of factors, this is really interesting, but I already have a full-time job running a ranch or running a farm. I don't have time to sit down and collect data and estimate these models. Totally understandable. Completely understand. So here's two resources that you can go to that have done that for you. Okay, so wheatbases.montana.edu. If you go there, that has, for Montana and Washington states, very specific locations and very specific protein levels that can predict bases and also give you a price estimate for both winter and spring wheat classes. Beefbasis.com is a similar site that looks at beef and cattle and feeder cattle, and there's definitely, I know of Billings, Miles City, and a couple other locations for Montana where basis is predicted, and so that's a really useful resource for cattle producers. Okay, so last question that we want to ask is, okay, so why are bases different from year to year, right? So if we can take all of these factors into account, and we know that local prices and futures prices, they move very closely together, why can't I just predict or calculate one historical basis value and then use that for the next 10 years? Well, here's the issue. When different events happen, they can impact futures prices and cash prices disproportionately. Okay, so for example, something that happens in Ukraine is not likely to directly affect Montana wheat markets, but it'll affect global wheat markets, right? And it'll affect future prices. And so futures prices might go up or down by a higher percentage than the impact that will translate and trickle down to local cash prices. Cash prices will also go up and down because of this thing that happened in Ukraine, but they may not change as much as futures prices change. Very similarly, and as I give you a few examples from recent history, local events can disproportionately affect basis because local events affect cash prices, local cash prices, more than futures prices. So a couple examples. In 2014, we had the peak of the Bakken oil boom, and many more rail cars were directed to delivering oil and were directed from the ag sector, and that was the year where wheat had a really good production year, and that caused basis to just drop through the floor for wheat because elevators had to pay through the nose for rail cars, and they were passing on those higher costs for rail cars down to farmers and in Montana, and that caused local cash prices to go down. But because the oil boom wasn't happening in the rest of the world or the rest of the US, futures prices didn't change that much, but cash prices did. And so cash prices dropped by a lot, futures prices stayed about the same, and so bases plummeted. Okay, and as soon as that oil boom kind of went away, bases returned back to normal. One example. Another example, this local drought in Montana and North Dakota this year, that's going to impact bases. It's probably going to have a little bit of a positive impact on prices in Montana because there's less of a supply in Montana and North Dakota. But everywhere else in the world, we're having a historic production year yet again. Russia has historic yields this year, and so that's so what's happening in Russia is going to affect futures prices in a very different way than the droughts that impacted Montana and North Dakota. And so that's going to change bases, and you have to keep an idea of that and keep that in the back of your head. A couple years ago, we had this drought in southwestern and western hay production. This was back in, I guess, 2011 and 2012. Where just California and Texas and Oklahoma, they were just burning up. They didn't have any hay, and so we had local cash prices in those regions, and in Montana they were differently affected than say futures prices would. Okay, so local events play a pretty big role, and national events that impact futures prices may not have as big a role in local markets, and so bases can change. So the takeaway from this is that it's really critical to pay attention to both local and global market conditions, because that will give you a sense of what basis might do, whether it weakens, goes more negative, or strengthens, goes more positive, and that'll give you a more accurate way of predicting what your possible price is going to be in the future. Okay, so let's wrap up. 3 major takeaways that I want you to get from this presentation, and hopefully you did. One is that basis is a really useful tool to understand market conditions and predict prices. It combines information, it combines the dynamics from both national and global and local markets, which is a much stronger instrument than just looking at futures prices or local prices alone. And because of that combination, it's a much more stable tool, and it gives a much better prediction and a much tighter range of prediction for prices going forward. And of course, that's really important for you to make decisions for your operation and thinking about how to make those decisions. And but despite basis being more volatile, it still changes. Okay, so there's still some risk to it, and you need to keep an eye on a lot of those factors that I listed in how to develop economic models or statistical models. A lot of those factors are going to impact basis values year to year. So if you pay attention to both global, national, and local conditions, you're going to have a much better idea of how basis is going to change, whether it's going to go up or down, and that will allow you to be even more accurate and make much more efficient and cost-effective decisions in your operation. Okay, I'll end with that. Going forward, if you want to know more information about basis, if you want to know more information about commodity markets, agricultural marketing, that's what I do. That's my research focus. You can get in touch with me. I'd be happy to walk you through any information. I'd be happy to just chat about this kind of stuff. I love talking about this stuff. It gives me a lot of ideas, talking with producers and agribusiness managers. So get in touch with me. A little plug for AgEconMT.com. That's a great resource where our team of economists in our department, we talk about marketing issues such as basis, such as factors that can impact markets and national prices and local prices. And so if you're looking for a good source of information in this region about marketing, about basis, about commodity markets, that's a great resource for you to have. Okay, thanks, and hope you guys have a great rest of the day.